Welcome to this audio-only version of this pertinent topic regarding slavery in ancient Africa. We hope to provide a new perspective on this controversial issue regarding African history. Have you ever wondered what the reality of slavery was like in ancient African societies? Let's dive into history to uncover the truth, moving beyond the myths popularized by the Bible and Hollywood, and unfortunately reinforced by so-called armchair YouTube historians. Our journey first takes us back to the pharaonic and imperial periods of Egypt, a time often misunderstood in terms of its labor practices. Contrary to popular belief, Egypt was not a hub of slave trade. The country's wealth was not built on the backs of enslaved people as it was in some parts of Europe or the Arab world. In fact, workers in ancient Egypt were organized into what can be called socio-professional castes. These castes, especially the one responsible for constructing grand monuments, enjoyed a status that might surprise many. They worked to honor Amana or Amen, who we call God, and Ra, a reference to the sun, but they were far from being oppressed. These workers were educated and paid, and were as free as any other citizen. The revered African historian, Sheikh Anta Diop, even highlighted the inalienable freedom of these Egyptian workers. Take, for example, the words inscribed on the tomb of Pharaoh Menkaure, the ruler for whom one of the Giza pyramids was built. His Majesty wants no man to be taken into forced labor but that everyone should work to his satisfaction. This speaks volumes about the labor practices of the time. Then there's the legendary Ramasumeriamana, now with the westernized name, Ramesses II, who expressed deep respect and care for his workers. "O chosen and valiant workers! I won't spare you my benefits, the food will flood you. I have also set up a large staff to provide for your needs." These are not the words of a ruler exploiting his people, but of one who valued and provided for them. There is a general consensus amongst historians that the extraordinary complexity and precision of ancient Egyptian monuments, which surpassed even modern construction techniques, could only have been achieved by workers who were highly skilled, fully committed, and in complete control of their faculties. Regarding the treatment of foreigners, it's important to note that Egyptologists universally acknowledge that ancient Egyptian language has no term equivalent to slave. This was confirmed by African-Caribbean scholar Jean-Philippe Omotunde, highlighting a significant difference in labor practices compared to other ancient civilizations. This absence of a word for slave suggests a different approach to labor, one potentially more equitable and respectful, even towards non-natives. Were the Jews ever slaves in Egypt? We have already discussed this in a previous video. Now let's shift our attention to the post-pharaonic era, during the southern dispersion of our ancestors. In ancient Africa, including areas like Madagascar, there was no system of slavery as we understand it today. Instead, there were two main forms of servitude. 1. Prisoners of war. Captives from wars, often occurring during state formation, usually became property of the royalty. Interestingly, these captives could integrate into society, sometimes even joining the army and achieving high ranks like that of a prince. They were treated as subjects of the king rather than as mistreated slaves, enjoying a relatively respectable status in the royal court. 2. Household servants. In traditional African societies, where prisons were rare, local justice was administered by community elders. People who committed wrongdoings or couldn't repay debts might become the property of another, often a creditor. This situation could sometimes extend over generations, creating a dependent caste. Treatment of these dependents varied. Those connected to the maternal side often gained respect and influence within the family. In contrast, those linked to the paternal side, while not mistreated, generally had a lower status and faced more social challenges. Both types of dependents had certain rights, like owning land, which was distributed by local chiefs. They had shelter, could farm, and even potentially become wealthy. For instance, in the Mossi Empire, now Burkina Faso, a member of this dependent caste was the third most important person in the state. In the Kingdom of Nongo, Angola, dependents participated in significant political decisions, like appointing the king. Overall, these forms of servitude in ancient Africa were different from the dehumanizing slavery seen in other parts of the world, with dependents often integrating into society and having certain rights and privileges. In the empires around the Niger Loop in West Africa, dependent tribes had specific roles, like providing grass for royal horses or fish for caravanners, as a form of tax, while maintaining their freedom and wealth. This system was markedly different from the harsh treatment of slaves in Europe or by Arabs in places like Iraq or Tanzania. Historical accounts support this. Historian Liliane Crete acknowledges that the conditions of these dependents couldn't be compared to slaves in the Americas. They were usually treated well, often becoming part of their master's family. Michel Izard, commenting on the Mossi people, notes that captives had personal autonomy, could marry, and cultivate land. Their relationship with their masters was akin to that of a family member. Louis Gustave Binger observed that these dependents were treated gently, living and being cared for similarly to their masters. African-American historian Chancellor Williams highlights that in Africa, enslaved persons were integrated into communities, could hold significant positions, and had rights similar to their masters. Ghanaian historian Albert Adu Bohen notes that among the Akan, dependents could own property, marry freely, and were often seen as full family members, well integrated into society. In some instances, dependents could be sold, but this was rare and usually under exceptional circumstances. For example, during the Songhai Empire, children from dependent castes were sold to buy horses, but only in unique situations like crime or starvation. The established fact is that, in Imperial Africa, the concept of slavery was more akin to a form of dependence, which was artisanal, close-knit, and didn't degrade the humanity of the servant, even if selling them was an option in extraordinary cases. This system was far from the brutal slaveholding practices seen in other parts of the world. Historical research reveals that the practice of slavery in the Maghreb region, before its cultural transformation in the 8th century, included both black Africans and Europeans. This area experienced significant demographic changes due to Arab and Turkish influences and the enslavement of white Christians in Europe. American academic Professor Robert Davis estimates that between 1530 and 1780, approximately 1,250,000 Europeans were enslaved in the Maghreb and Libya by Arabs, Turks, and both black and white Berbers. This period saw rampant kidnappings and collaboration among Europeans in selling their own people. Historian Bernard Lewis notes that there were Europeans willing to capture and sell their neighbors into slavery. Sub-Saharan blacks were also enslaved in the Maghreb, indicating a significant slave trade influence, mainly attributed to Arab cultural practices rather than traditional African ones. An example of the treatment of slaves in this region is seen in Morocco under the Black King Moulay Ismail. He is known for having 150,000 black and 25,000 white slaves. The black slaves, known as Abid al-Bukhari, were elevated to a powerful military force, reflecting a more African approach to their treatment. Upon Moulay Ismail's death, these black slaves played a crucial role in determining his successor. White slaves in Moulay Ismail's reign were tasked with the construction and maintenance of palaces. They were grouped by nationality and received payment and care, including hospitals and adequate food, from the Jewish community by royal decree. The conditions of these European slaves in the Maghreb contrasted with the harsher treatments seen in Europe. However, there are also accounts of severe captivity conditions, similar to American concentration camps. The Maghreb, ruled by Turks, Africans, and Arabs during this period, leaves it unclear to what extent Africans themselves practiced these harsher forms of detention. In summary, the form of slavery historically institutionalized by Europe and familiar in Semitic cultures was largely alien to traditional African societies. Excluding later Arab influences, enslavement in Africa was more similar to a community-imposed punishment and functioned on a smaller scale. In conclusion, the exploration of slavery and dependency in historical African contexts reveals a complex and nuanced picture. Far from the brutal and dehumanizing practices often associated with slavery in other parts of the world, African societies typically employed a system of servitude that was more integrated and respectful of individuals' humanity. This system, influenced in part by cultural and community norms, often allowed for a degree of autonomy and integration into society that was markedly different from the exploitative practices seen elsewhere.